Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Dominic McIver Lopez, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, British Columbia. Dom, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this, and so we're talking about a chapter that you wrote, and in a book that you collectively wrote with Benson Nene and Nick Riggle, which came out this year, 2022, from Oxford University Press, called Aesthetic Life and Why It Matters. And I love the book. It's a fantastic
Thank
teaching
you.
resource, and I can see lots of people using it in introductory aesthetics or just intro to philosophy as a unit in aesthetics. And in your chapter, you're really focusing on aesthetic value, and the role that aesthetic value plays in living the good life, basically. And so I
Mhm.
just, to start off, I just like to invite you to say, talk about aesthetic value and how you're thinking of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a view of aesthetic value that really opens up the picture that I present in the book Aesthetic Life and Why It Matters. The basic view of aesthetic value is presented elsewhere. It's presented in a book called Being for Beauty: Aesthetic Agency and Value. And there's an appendix in the book that we're talking about the that talks about my view on aesthetic value, but I'll give you the short story. So the main thing that I want to get across is that we have a too narrow, too constrained idea of what it is to engage in aesthetic life. So we think of aesthetic life as involving acts of contemplation. You go to the cinema, the lights dim, and you take in the movie. You go to the art gallery and you immerse yourself in a painting. You lose yourself in reading a book. That's contemplation, and of course there are artists, but we think of artists as people who make things for contemplation. So contemplation is where all the action is. I don't think contemplation is where all the action actually is, though. So if we think about all the ways that we engage in aesthetic activity, they're much more varied. So, kids at Knox College, your students at Knox College are probably enthusiasts for something. Maybe it's cooking. And so they prepare food, they share it with their friends, they try out new recipes. They might write reviews of meals or recipes online. Or maybe some of them are into music, and they collect folk music from the local community and they write it down so that other people can play it, and maybe they annotate it and explain what's going on. So there are lots of acts. There's editorial acts and curatorial acts and preservation acts. These are all part of the larger aesthetic sphere. It's not just all about contemplation. Okay, well, why? So once I say that, you probably realize, okay, that's true, but contemplation is still central. Um, and I think that's still a mistake, because what we see when we think about the rich range of aesthetic acts that we engage in is that we see that we engage in those acts as members of communities. So I'm collecting the folk songs, editing them so that you can write about them, and then somebody else shares them, somebody else produces them for the radio. We're all doing our thing together, centered around the same activity, say folk music or cooking or whatever it happens to be. We have these communities, and I think of aesthetic value as the set of values that enables members of that community to coordinate with each other. In fact, to be a community at all. To be a community, they have to share a conception of the aesthetic good, and then they act on that conception together. So that's the picture of aesthetic value that's opened up when we realize that contemplation is great, but it's only part of the picture. And that view of aesthetic value is what opens the door to what I call the venture account in aesthetic life and why it matters.
Yeah, I love the picture of people in a community collaborating and cooperating. And further, it doesn't assume that they all have identical backgrounds, or what it assumes is that they have overlapping interests, right? And so people bring their different overlapping interests to bear on the community, which is a way of, negotiating who's a member of the community, who's not, what the values of the community are. And, it further allows the community to change and evolve and grow or shrink as needed over time, right?
Maybe we should think about communities instead of community. So there was a time when we just about by necessity all lived together. So each of us lived in a village with a small group of other people, and that was a community that shared a musical culture and a visual culture and a culinary culture, and they dressed the same way and they spoke the same way, right? And so it looked as if those things all belonged together. There was a way of making music that seemed to go with the way of cooking, that seemed to go with the way of dress, right? That still exists. So you might see somebody walking down the street and they're dressed like a goth, and you might say, okay, I know what kind of music they listen to. I know what kind of books they read. I know, you might think that you've got their number entirely. But in fact, we have way more wiggle room like than that. So it's possible to mix and match. It's possible to be a member of a musical community. You have musical interests that you share with other people, and the people in that music world don't overlap at all with your movie buddies. They don't overlap at all with the people with whom you share a style of cooking. Don't overlap at all with the people with whom you share a style of dress. We've got, I don't think we've got this flexibility. I don't think we're using it as much as we could yet. There's still too much. We're still imposing upon ourselves overlap for other social reasons. Yeah, maybe communities is a better word than community.
Yeah, so it's a pluralistic account of the multiple communities we move in and out of throughout, our lives. And that idea of moving in and out of communities, hooks precisely into the venture account that you give, right? Which is precisely about this idea of finding new sources of value in the world through engaging with new types of things that are just to some degree related to what you're already interested in. So can you talk a bit about the venture account that you give in the book?
Yeah, so the idea, I begin just with the observation that we move through aesthetic options, or we move through aesthetic communities. All right. As individuals, we do that diachronically, fancy word for across time or through our lives. So thank God you're not listening. You listeners out there are not listening to the same music as you listened to when you were 5 years old. I mean, it was great when you were five, but I bet you've moved on. Ditto for your taste in dress, your taste in movies, your taste in books. So throughout our lives, we move on. We do have a picture that that's what happens to children, and then they become adults, and then they're set. And and for some of us, that's true. I think we exaggerate how much that happens. I think most of us are constantly on the lookout for new developments that are going to express our personal style, are going to elaborate our sense of who we are as aesthetic individuals. So we're looking to change. We're generally not all that happy to stay fixed in one place. Okay, so that's a way to think about crossing boundaries from one kind of aesthetic community to another over a lifetime, but we also do it synchronically at the same time. So here I am in Vancouver now, and I might be looking for new things to get into, or for new things even just to dabble in. So that whole range from a really serious commitment to just a little bit of a taste. A city like this offers me a million options, and the internet offers me a million options. And when you're in college, right, you're meeting people from all over the world, from all walks of life, and you want to share and exchange. Oh, what's that you're listening to? Where does that come from? What does it mean? What is that instrument? How is it played? We're looking for that. I think we're looking for it because we're finding good things. And so this is where this is the observation that is at the core of the venture account. The core of the venture account is the idea that we want to explore generally, and aesthetic possibilities are just made for explorability. They're just perfect to be explored. And so aesthetic life offers us an opportunity to spread our wings and fly and go new places.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so do you think that, what you just said is that we generally do, but some people do for lengthy periods of time in their life get stuck in an aesthetic rut where they're eating the same sort of food, they're watching the same reruns of the same TV shows, they're watching the same movies, they're dressing the same way. Do you think that someone who's stuck in a rut aesthetically, if we want to call it that, which that may be uncharitable, and who is perfectly happy, watching the same things over and over again, eating the same kinds of food over and over again. Do you think that their lack of adventurousness is criticizable in any way, or that we should at the very least encourage them to, hey, why don't you try this new thing, or why don't you check out, this movie or this band or this album or whatever?
Yeah. Let's consider a range of cases. So there can be somebody who's just exhausted, anxious, depressed, and it's all too much, and they just need to hunker down, and not go out looking for new things, and that's got to be okay, right? And there are people who are in circumstances. The world is a pretty rotten place. Parts of the world are pretty rotten place, and some people are just surviving, right? And so if you're worried about feeding your kids every day, my coming along and saying, hey, you should spread your wings and fly is going to sound pretty empty, and rightfully so. So I'm not like, this is some like deep obligation. You're not fully human unless that's not what I want to say at all. And then it's also important to recognize that there are cultures that really value stasis. They value not really changing very much. So this was perhaps more true in the past, more common in the past than it is now. Isolated cultures in places where they had very little contact with anybody else, they would develop a scheme of how things should be that they would pass on to their children, pass on to their children, pass on to their children. And I think if a community wants to work that way, that is fine too. So the proposal that I'm making is not a you must do this sort of claim. That is just not appropriate for what we're talking about. So these are some cases. It's also important to distinguish cases where people think they're in a rut from cases where they're not really in a rut. So often when we talk about aesthetics, the first thing that comes to mind is the fine arts, right? So your students taking an aesthetics course probably expect to hear a lot about highbrow stuff, opera and classical music and Jonathan Franzen rather than Harry Potter, and certain kinds of movies, but not others. And a lot of people just don't care about that high art stuff, and I'm totally cool with that. So I'm like, I think that human beings have a natural interest. It can be set aside in certain circumstances, but a natural interest in having some aesthetic life. But it doesn't have to be highfalutin. So, I've given examples of dress and food, but it could be how you present yourself. It could be how you decorate your house. It could be how you mow your lawn and clip your hedges, right? So there are parts of the United States where this is very important, and I think it's great that that's really important. It's a way of expressing a vision, an aesthetic vision. I wish I could have lawns like that. I'm just not up to it.
Yeah, you've just described
So,
some of my neighbors.
so, so that's so okay. Can you imagine a person who really is stuck in a rut with respect to anything aesthetic? Like they don't care how they dress, they don't care how they appear to other people, they don't care what they eat. Like they're just like roll a dice when they go to a restaurant. They none of this, or maybe so that they not care, but they don't care about exploring a little bit. That's harder to believe. I'm not saying it never happens, but I just want to emphasize that this idea of being stuck in a rut can seem, we can set the threshold lower than is realistic for being stuck in a rut. So we might be stuck in ruts in some aspects of our aesthetic lives, but probably it's unusual for that to happen in all aspects of our aesthetic lives. But even if we have somebody who's stuck in a rut, and it's not because they're in a war zone, it's not because they're depressed or anything like that, I think that's still okay. As the venture account says, we have a need to explore. We have actually an interest in exploring. So it's weaker than a need. We have an interest. And aesthetic life serves that interest, but I don't think it's the only thing that does. Other things do too. And so you might serve that interest in other ways.
Yeah, right. That you could get really interested in history or politics or something of that sort.
Or sports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though sports do have an aesthetic element to them. And I
That's
mean,
true.
politics does too. I mean, like how fascists dress and stuff.
It's actually, I think it's aesthetic value is everywhere. It's in everything. I'll tell you a story. I was at a party on campus, and I was talking to an engineer. She's a mechanical engineer, and I was asking about her work, and she was asking me about my work. And I said, "Hey, listen, suppose you're building a part, like, and it's for some machine, and it's going to go inside the machine, and nobody's ever going to see it. And there's two ways you can design the part. If you design it one way, it's going to be beautiful, and if you design the other way, it's not going to be beautiful. Do you care?" And she said, "Heck," that wasn't quite the word. "Heck, yes." Definitely. So even engineers who are building things that are not going to be seen by anybody care about the aesthetics out of it. So I think it's actually baked into almost everything that we do, hence unavoidable.
Yeah, awesome. So can we talk just a bit about like the process of venturing out into the aesthetic world and how that functions? And so, as you talk about in the chapter, some things are just easier for us to venture. There are some areas that are easier for us to venture into given our backgrounds, right? So it's way easier for someone like me who, has a background in hard rock and heavy metal to get into, you know, uh, punk music, say, than it is to get into like Javanese gamelan music or something of that sort. So can we talk just a bit about that process?
Actually, I think gamelan might be a little bit easier for you than you think. I mean, it is just the level of noise and the sheer wall of sound that comes at you is like a rock concert. It's really something else. But maybe you would find, Viennese waltzes to be like, oh, I just don't, it's not doing anything for me. Yeah. So we have these communities that are coordinating with each other on values. They speak the language of value for the community, but the languages overlap because they grow out of each other, just like human languages, right? So English comes out of Old English, which comes out of Old German, right? And it goes back, there's a history there. So the languages develop from each other, and that means that when we speak an aesthetic language, it's far easier for us to learn its sister tongues than very distant ones. And so the pull to the sister tongues can be really strong. So and this is what happens. We follow a path, who say, oh, here I am, I'm into heavy metal. There's this thing that happened in the 1970s, punk. What's going on with that? And then you learn about that, and then maybe that pulls you into ska. And so now you're listening to English ska, and then now you're listening to Jamaican reggae. And you never would have imagined that there's a path from heavy metal to Jamaican reggae, but I just sketched it for you, right? And so that is how we move around in aesthetic space. Typically, we can make big jumps, but that requires a lot of effort, right? Just like learning a pretty, a language in a pretty unfamiliar language group. So that's how it works. I mean, that's how the path is paved. I mean, I guess it works because we have motivations. And I think our motivations can be all over the map. I mean, you you get a bunch of friends who are into something and you want to be into what they're into, or a partner and you want to get into their interests, or you find yourself in Tokyo and you say, oh, I've got to figure out what's going on here, right? So these are the things that are the motivators, but the closeness between languages is what paves the path.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I think, one thing that I find really appealing about your view is that it's the community itself, collectively, that decides what the values are relative to the particular domain, right? It's not like, there are these Humean ideal critics out there who, we need to imagine or appeal to in some way, and they're the arbiters of all value across all domains, right? It's that no, that these experts or critics are local to particular domains, right? And further, there's a sense in which it's distributed among members of the community and not just particular individuals within it.
Everybody has a part to play. So even somebody buying a movie ticket is shifting, nudging Hollywood in one direction and not another, right? So they have a part to play as well. Tiny part, but those tiny parts accumulate. So, I mean, I think there's a beautiful story to be told here. You say the community determines what the language is, and it's not these ideal critics. But the community doesn't do that by like convening a conference and saying, let these be the values. It emerges organically. The values emerge organically. How so? Well, everybody is trying to do well, whatever they're enthusiastic about. So if I'm the folk music editor and you're the folk music collector, I want to do a good job of editing. You want to do a good job of collecting. Our third friend wants to do a good job of playing the fiddle, right? So we're all trying to do a good job, and we're going to migrate to the language that enables us all to do a better job. And then extended beyond a group of three, it could be a million, right? And it could be an online community. Everybody's just trying to do their best, but they're relying on other people, so they need to do their best as well. And we'll find the language that enables us to coordinate. And this also means that what I call the profile, the language of the community can change, will change, is very likely to change over time, under the control of the community. And so that's a thing about aesthetic life that I find quite attractive, that it's one of the spaces in our world that is amenable to our kind of control that we don't often have. We don't have this kind of control over our natural environment, for instance, or our politics. We wish we did, but we don't. But little communities or large communities can exercise control, and even those small players have a part to play.
Yeah, and further, it's precisely what you said, that they are pretty much necessarily going to change over time. Is some people leave the group, other people enter the group, and it's interesting that to become an insider, right? You're an outsider and you want to get into a particular aesthetic domain, whether it's cooking or a particular type of food, that you really want to get into Thai food or Indian cooking or something of that sort. And part of that process is precisely learning the language, right? Learning the lingo. If you want to get into jazz, you need to learn the lingo. You need to learn what jazz aficionados are into, and what jazz aficionados are into changes over time, sort of through this process of the musicians changing over time and the interests of the musicians changing over time, and they're influenced by, rock or soul or blues or whatever. I don't know. I'm rambling now, I think, but but I don't know.
Well,
Do you have thoughts about that?
yeah. So an important move in the piece is to introduce this distinction between insiders and outsiders. So obviously we've got a community, and it's a fraught question: who's in the community, right? And we know that there can be people who are inserted into the community, and they do no good, right? They just really mess things up for everybody else, and we don't want to call them insiders, right? They put themselves in and they spoil it. So I think of an insider as somebody who acts. They do their aesthetic actions, editing, curating, performing, whatever, knowing the language of the community in a way that promotes good performance on the part of everybody else. So it floats everybody else's boats. So that's what an insider is. An insider is somebody who has their own agenda and but they act in a way that enables everybody else to act well as well. So it solidifies the coordination rather than breaking down the coordination. Whereas the person who's the pretend insider is somebody who speaks the language and doesn't benefit everybody else. They probably just benefit themselves, and everybody else is worse off. So that's, I think, a really useful conception of what it is to be inside a community. It's not enough just to speak the language. You have to speak the language in a way that supports the rest of the community. Okay, and then there are outsiders. And there's two kinds of outsiders. You might not really be into, you're the heavy metal guy, and might not really be into punk, but you can kind of see what's going on there, right? You understand it, and you can see how these features of the punk community are reasons for members of the community to act as they do. You can see why the values support the actions. So notice that value and action, keep value, action, and community. These are the three themes of my picture here. So there you're an outsider. You're not engaging. You're not acting, but you can understand from their perspective why their values make sense. And then there's the kind of outsider who just can't even see that. So in the chapter, I tell the story of my first encounter with Balinese gamelan. And I just thought, oh my God, what the heck is this? I couldn't understand it at all. I mean, there were things in it that I appreciated, the wall of sound and the shimmering and the brilliance, but I was under no illusions that I understood what was going on. And so I was a different kind of outsider, an incomprehending outsider. So there are the insiders who float everybody's boats. There are the outsiders who can see what's going on. And then there are the incomprehending outsiders.
Yeah, and related to that too, one of the things you talk about that I think is really important is the fact that the values between different communities are incommensurable. That's the word I'm looking for, right? That the fact that I love heavy metal does not mean that I get to say, well, punk is terrible because it's not metal, right? Or because I'm a rock fan and you're a disco fan, that I'm somehow superior to you because disco sucks and rock is clearly better, right? That they're two different domains, they're two different values, and there's no, negotiating between them in that way, at least.
I have to tell you, I get a lot of pushback on this. I get a lot of pushback on this from philosophers, and I get a lot of pushback on this from non-philosophers. People want to be able to rank stuff. We just are obsessed with ranking. And so we rank like individual works. So like we're obsessed with best movie lists and best song lists and stuff like that. And we're obsessed with ranking genres. so we're obsessed with ranking genres of movies and ranking genres of music, and we want to say, oh, that sucks and this is great. And I just do not get it. I don't know. I can't see how this. Here I am. I'm into my thing. I don't know. I'm learning guitar. I'm learning folk guitar or something. I don't see how I'm any better at that by dissing, big band jazz, or Taylor Swift, right? You know, I I kind of think if I think Taylor Swift is great, I'm probably going to be better at what I'm doing, no matter what I'm doing, and generalize, not just Taylor Swift, but everything. So I think that everything has its place, and there's nothing pushing us to this ranking thing. So yeah, I think of the values as incommensurable. That means that if you ask the question, what is better, hip hop or heavy metal? There's no good answer. I just think there's no good answer, and therefore, it's a silly question that shouldn't even be asked. They just do different things for different people, and like I don't see anybody being harmed by any music at all, right? Music just doesn't harm people. Neither do the clothes that we wear, or the way we comb our hair, or the way we decorate our houses, or the way we cut our lawns. There are social forces behind this, right? So yeah, maybe being the way I put in the chapter is if you're a red state, you're going to like certain kinds of aesthetics things, and if you're blue state, it's another kind of. So maybe it's just all about signaling the politics. But then why are we doing this to our aesthetic lives, which should be this really joyful, playful zone for us? And we can have our political disagreements anyway, without letting them seriously ruin everything in life that is fundamentally, at the end of the day, important.
Yeah, and I think, the issue of ranking, as long as it's done in the spirit of playfulness and within particular domains, right? So that I can argue with other David Bowie fans about which is better, low or larger, right? Which two albums or which particular songs are better. And, that's a way of expressing our own individuality within the community and trying to figure out what other people like and stuff like that. But to do it in like this authoritarian sort of mode of no, this one's clearly better. If you think this other one's better, you're dumb or you are bad or something of that sort.
So I think disagreement is important in aesthetic life. So when you and I are members of the same community, the David Bowie fan world, we're trying to figure out what David Bowie's all about. And one way to figure out what David Bowie's about, it's an excellent case because he's so like he's not one thing. He's, I don't know, 20 different things, right? To figure out what that is, we might disagree with each other as a way to hone in. That's a fruitful disagreement to try to coordinate on the language that we share, to hone in on the language. But when we're in different communities, we can't be doing that, right? We speak in different languages, then our disagreement about which is better is not actually doing anything for us. So disagreement is fine when it serves a purpose. And I can see how it serves a purpose inside the community. But I'm really wary of what's going on when there are disagreements between communities. I think it's other fights going on, and the aesthetic disagreements are proxy for those other fights.
Yeah. No, that seems entirely right. And I like the idea that it's us, within the community trying to figure out not just, who we are in a sense as a community or what our values are, but ultimately, I think you're right. We're trying to figure out the artist that we're interested in, or, whatever the object is, or the maker or producer is. That's the thing that, in a sense, we're sort of all circling around, is that we as David Bowie fans are trying to figure out David Bowie, and we're figuring ourselves out in the process, both individually and collectively.
And David Bowie could be many things at different times. And so you might have, right, different conceptions in the community of what's going on in the David Bowie era. And that shows the richness of it.
Yeah.
So there's incredible richness in, I think, in all of these aesthetic domains. Some people will say, oh, it's just not like 19th century classical music is so rich. And what can you do with the bagpipes? Well, I think that's just a mistake. You can do lots of rich things with bagpipes.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you, Dom. I think, we've talked a lot about this, and this is a really fantastic discussion. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And if anybody would ever like to contact me about the ideas in these books, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. Take care.
Okay, you too.